I have a theory about life. As life is a series of us asking the question, now what? I mean, think about it. As you look back on your life, I imagine you can pinpoint several situations where you found yourself having to ask, now what? Think about it. We go to elementary school. We go to middle school. We go to high school. And then all of a sudden, when high school's over, you're left with your first big, now what? Do I go to college? If the answer to that is yes, then there's a whole slew of other questions. Where do I go to college? What do I want to study in college? What do I actually want to study in college? If you don't go to college, then you're struck with the question that hits the college kids a couple years later. What am I going to do with my life? As you carry on, the now what's never seem to stop. Sometimes they have a good cause. Sometimes they don't have such a great cause, but over and over we have to ask, now what? What are we going to do next? As you read the Bible, it's full of God's people asking these same questions, especially when you look at Jesus' disciples. As we come to today, Ascension Sunday, they've had an interesting month and a half. The person that they had been following around got arrested and executed. You have to think, on Good Friday and Holy Saturday, the disciples have a whole lot of now whats. Are they coming for me next? What should we do? Do we run and hide? Do we stay in Jerusalem? Now what? But then Jesus rose from the dead. And the disciples again had a whole slew of, now what? Because if you remember, the disciples up to this point had locked themselves in a room because they were afraid for their lives. And yet Jesus shows up and says, here I am. They don't really know how to deal with that, even though they might vaguely remember Jesus saying something about him dying and rising on the third day, because he kind of said that a lot. But since the disciples are, like us, not always the sharpest tools in the shed, they were a little confused. So they think they have Jesus back. And they do have Jesus back for about 40 days. Until all of a sudden, while he's in the middle of talking to them, I love the way Luke puts that. While he was blessing them, he went into heaven. And the disciples, if you read the version of it that Luke recounts in the book of Acts, are apparently left standing there with kind of stupid looks on their face, just going, huh. Because we read in Acts that an angel shows up and says, do you know when there's a scene in Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade. Indiana Jones is riding a tank off a cliff with one of the bad guys, and he falls off the cliff, and Indy's dad and his friends are all looking over the cliff, and they're just, hats on their hearts. And then all of a sudden, Indiana Jones comes up behind them and looks over the cliff, looks at them, looks over the cliff again. I like to think of the angel coming up on the disciples kind of like Indiana Jones did, and whether they're looking up at this guy, and the angel's like, what are you guys looking at? Jesus. Oh, well, he'll be back. Don't worry about that. Until then, just do what he said. And so after 10 days, the disciples end up receiving the Holy Spirit, and they go around everywhere doing what Jesus said. But when Jesus leaves, they're kind of like, okay, now he's gone again, but we know he's coming back. The last time he said he was going to be gone, he came back. He's probably going to come back pretty soon. If you read the New Testament, you definitely get the sense that they expected Jesus to be coming back at any time. And so as time went on, and Jesus hadn't come back yet, they started to get a little concerned. Because the first time, Jesus was gone for 3 days, and then he came back. But as it got to be, close to 100 years that Jesus still hadn't come back, they didn't quite know what to do. It got so bad that at one point, there were some folk at the church in Corinth that said, the resurrection of the dead already happened and we're it. And Paul had to write a letter to correct that behavior because, like humans tend to do, not only did they say the resurrection of the dead happened and we're it, but they said the resurrection of the dead happened, we're it, and we're better than you because of it. Because humans, being humans, do that kind of thing. And Paul straightened them out right quick in the Corinthian letters, but they were trying to sort out, what are we going to do about Jesus not being back yet? So they ended up solving this reasonably straightforwardly by saying, yes, Jesus is coming back soon. And they defined soon as any time between right now and the new creation. If you've ever been waiting for a movie or a video game that ended up never coming out, or a book, I think George R.R. Martin, I would really appreciate the next book of your series now. You know what that kind of soon can feel like. When it could happen anytime, but it could also happen anytime. So this is how we look at Jesus' return. That yes, he is coming back. It could happen right now, but it might not happen until a really, really long time from now. This causes some problems, of course, because it's easy to get complacent when you're waiting for something that could be any time between right now and a really, really long time from now, which is probably why Jesus gave so many parables about keeping watch and waiting and being ready. But this is how the early church had to deal with the now what of Jesus hasn't come back yet. So now what can we do when we find ourselves in a now what? How do we know what those next steps are? Like the disciples after Jesus' ascension or the disciples after Jesus' return took quite a bit longer than they thought it would. Well, let me tell you a little story. It happened close to 7 years ago now. And I was just getting ready to graduate from seminary. And I had no idea what I was going to do. I mean, I knew I was going to do something pastorally, but at the time I was working as a programmer for a school district, and my boss more or less said, as soon as you graduate, you have a job still, so don't worry about anything. So I was like, okay, this is nice. So I didn't have to worry. Some of my classmates were a little bit more frantic in trying to find a call, and the ones that were most frantic ended up being the ones that got called first. But, which kind of cool how that worked out. The ones who were the most worried about finding a job after seminary were the ones that got called before the rest of us. So anywho, I heard about an opening at a church in a faraway land. Oh, so far away. It was so far away that it felt like forever. And I can tell you, this is my exact thought process. Holy Cross has an opening for a pastor. They'll never call me in a million years, so let's just apply, and then I can get a feel for how the process goes. Dead serious, that is exactly what I thought when I applied up here. Because, I'm not what I would have expected this church to have for a pastor. And so, I didn't really think anything of it, so I, sent in my resume, and then no one was more surprised than me when all of a sudden I get a call saying, "Hey, we'd like to have a phone interview with you." Okay, sure, we'll have a phone interview, why not? It's going through the process. So, had the phone interview, get called back. "Hey, we'd like to have you come up." Now, the whole time I'm thinking, are you sure? Did I misrepresent myself in the phone interview? What happened here? So I come up, and then, again, no one more surprised than me when I get another call saying, "Hey, we'd like to offer you the call." Like, oh, well, all right, great. The next day, I go to school at the seminary and telling some people, "Hey, I got, Holy Cross had that opening. They offered me the call." And one of my friends, he comes up to me and says, "Oh, yeah, I applied up there, and then I changed my mind because God told me you were going to get it." And I'm just like, you've been holding on to this information for how long? So here I was, 27, fresh out of seminary, not looking very pastorly in general, and I'm here at Holy Cross. How's that for an answer to a now what? It definitely didn't go the way I expected it to, but I'm very happy that it went that way. Now, the whole point of that story is when we ask God the question, now what? He's going to answer it for us. It might always be in the way that it probably won't be in the way that we expect him to answer it for us, but he will answer it. It's up to us to be receptive to what he is going to be doing for us. And there's a lot of ways that we can be open to hearing his voice when we ask him these now what kind of questions. Oftentimes it's as simple as talking it out with a Christian friend who can kind of point you in a direction you were already aiming for anyways. Sometimes it's just a small nudging inside you that says, go this way. And if you're a really lucky person, and I'm not one of these, I've known some folk who really do hear God telling them exactly what to do. I think God's told me to do that twice, and me being a rather stubborn person, I did the exact opposite both times and regretted it immediately. Because I'm not very smart. I'm a very stubborn person, and I'm not very smart. I learned my lesson, but if you ever think God is telling you to do something, just don't be Moses. Just go with what he says. It's safer. And I'll just leave it at that. And so, another way that we can hear God's voice is things not working out in the other direction. Again, in my own life, I've told many of you this, how I ended up going down the path to become a pastor. It's in large part because every other door shut. And sometimes that's the way that God answers our question, now what? And we might not be very happy with it at the time, but again, now looking back on it, I'm pretty pleased that those doors shut. But these are all ways that God tells us what to do next. And in a lot of ways, we have it easier than many of the folk in the Bible, because up until the day of Pentecost, they didn't have the Holy Spirit guiding them. Before the day of Pentecost, they had to try to figure out things on their own. If you notice in the second chapter of Acts, they are drawing lots to pick who is going to replace Judas among the disciples. They're basically throwing dice and figuring out who's next, who's the replacement. After the day of Pentecost, they never do that again. Whenever they have to make a decision, they get together, they pray, and they trust that the Holy Spirit's going to be in that process. Because that is the biggest advantage that we have when figuring out, now what? The Holy Spirit who lives in us and guides us and leads us, both so that we can grow closer to God and that we can bring others closer to God in turn. Now, a little teaser, we'll talk more about the Holy Spirit next week. But just remember that when we have these decisions to make, God is going to guide us and lead us. Because Jesus says over and over again, He will never leave us alone. Even when He ascends to heaven, He sends a comforter, a guider, a leader in the form of the Holy Spirit, so that He is always with us. And then when we have decisions to make, when we have things that are tough and we don't know what's next, we can lean on Him for those answers.